Hi, I'm Theorist Rigor, and in this video, we'll be talking about Carl Rogers and the person-centered theory. But first, an outline of the topics for discussion. We'll start by discussing the theorist, who is Carl Rogers, and what are some important pieces of information that would be helpful for us to know. And then we'll talk about the theory. What is the background of this theory? What are the assumptions that guided its formulation? What is the personality structure that Carl Rogers identified? And then we'll talk about the important processes that fall under this theory, specifically self-actualization and congruence, and incongruence and defensive processes. Afterwards, we'll talk about the client-centered therapy approach, which was actually the focal point of Carl Rogers' work, not really the theory itself, and the important assessment tools that were developed in line with the person-centered theory. Let's get started. So we'll start with talking about the theorist. Who is Carl Rogers anyway? First of all, Carl Rogers is an American psychologist, and we'll focus more on his educational and career background. So for his education, it's important for us to know that he was an achiever ever since he was young. He skipped kindergarten and first grade, actually. And in the course of his education, he actually shifted courses multiple times. He began his college studies in agriculture, then shifted to history, and he was planning to become a minister. So after graduating college with a degree in history, he entered the seminary. But while in the seminary, he learned a few things. He attended this student-led recollection where he began to question his religion. And through that questioning, he became interested in the study of psychology. So he shifted to this field of study. He saw it as a way of being able to study life without having to commit to any specific doctrines, dogma, or to a specific school of thought. Now for his career, he initially worked in the academe after finishing his PhD in psychology, but that didn't last too long. He was more of a practitioner, a clinician, or a psychotherapist. So in that aspect, he was quite similar to Freud, because if you remember, Freud was actually a clinician in his practice. That's where he gathered most of his ideas and his data for his theory. And because of this, people would describe him as a reluctant theorist because he was able to develop all of these ideas. He was able to come up with these concepts and organize them into a theory, but he himself felt like he wasn't really a theorist because he was more on the side of practice. And one of the most important parts of his career was his development of a very well-known and very widely used approach, which is non-directive therapy. Nowadays, it's more commonly known as client-centered therapy. And because of his work, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1987. So here we can see just how significant his work was and where he came from, not really from the academe, but more from practice. So important things to remember from this brief description of who Carl Rogers is. What is he best known for? First is developing client-centered therapy. As I mentioned earlier, it was formerly known as non-directive therapy. And being one of the founders of humanistic psychology, kind of like Abraham Maslow. So let's talk about this theory itself. We'll start with the background. This theory can be classified as a phenomenological theory because it emphasizes the individual's subjective experience of his or her own world, and we'll learn more about how this is phenomenological later on. But apart from being classified as a phenomenological theory, it can also be considered a humanistic theory. It is considered one because of its focus on humans and their capability to achieve their potential. Similar to how Abraham Maslow focused on needs and our abilities to meet these needs and achieve our human potential, which is self-actualization. So one thing I'd like to highlight further is that Rogers was actually reluctant to have his theory labeled as such. That's why I use quotation marks around the word theory whenever it is flashed on the screen. So now that we know about the background of the person-centered theory, let's get to know the assumptions that guided this perspective and its development. There are three main assumptions that we will focus on for this lecture video. The first is the phenomenological perspective. Rogers was interested in the experience of the observer, or specifically how the person experiences the world. Unlike other psychological theories of personality, Rogers and the person-centered theory was actually interested in the experience of the observer, specifically how the person experiences the world. So if you think about it, this is quite a unique approach because behaviorism would focus on rewards, consequences, and the external environment affecting our behavior, while trait psychologists, for example, would focus on genetics and our biological makeup or our physiological characteristics and how these tend to predict and explain our behaviors. So if you notice, this is a very different perspective from those. In fact, he captures it in this statement. I do not react to some absolute reality, but to my perception of this reality. And that is what he wanted to highlight, the person's perception of reality and how that impacts their personality. So when we talk about reality here, what does that mean? We hear reality a lot. Here, it's important to know that Rogers refers to reality as the private world of experience or the phenomenal field. So when he says phenomenal field, this is the space of our perceptions that makes up our experience. It consists of subjective constructions or subjective interpretations of experiences and events around us. So according to Rogers, what we see is a subjective construction that reflects our personal needs. So you see here, there's a little bit of a crossover with how Maslow viewed personality, right? Since they're both humanistic in nature. The second assumption is the positivity of human motivation. For Rogers, the core of our nature is essentially positive. What does that mean? For him, humans' most fundamental motivation is towards positive growth. This had to be said because some institutions teach us otherwise, specifically religion and psychoanalysis. For example, with religion, the teaching is we're born sinners and we need to behave a certain way for us to become saved or cleansed. While for psychoanalysis, the belief is that we're born with our id and civilization is what sort of teaches us to become more socialized, to behave more appropriately. From those perspectives, according to Rogers, we are born or we begin to exist with more negative motivations and more negative qualities within us. And then it's the outside world that shapes us into better versions of ourselves. Whereas he views us as positive at our core. And our fundamental motivation is to grow towards positive growth, is to move towards positive growth. So whenever we see or whenever we notice that certain people aren't behaving towards positive growth, then he explains it as these people not being too free in their environments. So he believes that when there are constraints or when there's a lack of freedom in terms of how we can behave, how we can be ourselves, that prevents us from moving towards positive growth. We'll learn more about positive growth and what exactly this means to Rogers and in this theory when we talk about the different processes that are integral in this theory. The third assumption is that feelings of authenticity are of utmost importance, to the point that Rogers identifies a healthy person as an authentic person. And when we experience an alienation or detachment, which happens when we think but don't feel an attachment to our own values. For example, we believe that honesty is important, but we don't necessarily feel an attachment to it. We just know that it is important, but we don't really practice it. We don't see the actual importance of it. That is an alienation or detachment. That leads to psychological distress. And of course, we've all felt this from time to time. We all have certain values that were taught to us, but do not really resonate that much with us. And these cause a certain sense of alienation or detachment from these values or from them being parts of us. And that doesn't sit well with us. But what Rogers is saying is that persons can experience congruence or feelings of authenticity. It's possible, even if there are these instances, because there are times when you actually think about something that is important and it actually feels like it is important to you. Like maybe for some of you, doing well is something that your parents or your guardians or people around you have told you is important. You have to get good grades, you have to study well, and all of these things. But for some of you, you might not feel like you agree with it, or you might not feel like it's something that you take to heart. But for some of you, it's something that you feel is a part of you and you feel is important in yourself. Those are experiences of congruence and feelings of authenticity. So these are states in which an individual's inner, viscerally felt values are consistent with goals and experiences that they have. So when these things align, when the teachings that have been externally introduced to you align with your visceral, your own personal subjective feelings and the goals that you have, then that is an experience of congruence or a feeling of authenticity. And the assumption is all of us are capable, or all of us have experienced this to a certain extent. So this is another important assumption that guided the development of the person-centered theory. Now that we know about its background and the assumptions that guided its formulation, what are the important elements in the person-centered theory, according to Carl Rogers? Well, the first to consider is the phenomenal field. I already mentioned this earlier when we talked about the phenomenological perspective. Remember that the phenomenal field is that space wherein you have subjective interpretations of your experiences of events around you. So the phenomenal field virtually covers everything that you experience and how you perceive these experiences to be. But a specific focus of the person-centered theory is one aspect of the phenomenal field called the self. So the self is considered as a subset of the phenomenal field, and this represents an organized and consistent set of perceptions that an individual possesses. These are perceptions that can change, but tend to maintain a certain pattern and organized quality within the self. So the self is kind of like the organization system for your subjective perceptions of your experiences. The self is a structure that endures over time and tends to characterize the individual. And the self is responsible for organizing these perceptions, but also for using them in behaving a certain way, in responding a certain way. And the self is considered primarily conscious by Rogers, unlike in psychoanalysis or the psychodynamic perspectives, where the perception of the self is quite different. There are two aspects of the self that Rogers highlights further. These are the actual self and the ideal self. So this is illustrated in this way because the actual self pertains to you as you are right now, at this very moment. That is the actual self. All of the skills that you possess, all of the resources that you possess, the thoughts, the learnings, and the emotions, that is your actual self. But there's another component called the ideal self. The ideal self, according to Rogers, is your potential self in the future. So that's why there's a thought bubble and there's a girl that's in the thought bubble, because it is how you think of yourself or how you see yourself in the future. And because the belief is that we are oriented towards positive growth, this ideal self is a self-concept that the individual most likely is a self-concept that we would like to achieve or to possess somewhere down the line. So according to Rogers, we will try to behave in ways that will help us achieve this ideal self. And when we aren't able to behave in such a way, whether it is a way that is not aligned with our actual self and how we perceive ourselves, or our ideal self, how we would like to see ourselves in the future, or how we do see ourselves in the future, we tend to feel some sort of tension, right? And that's where we'll talk about congruence and incongruence. That's where the important processes of the person-centered theory come in. So we'll start with the more positive, which is self-actualization and congruence. According to Rogers, all people have an inherent need to grow and to achieve our potentials, or to achieve self-actualization. So if you recall, Maslow had a very similar perspective that all people are moving towards self-actualization and that this is the highest level of need that we have. If for Maslow, there was this hierarchy of needs that sort of told us in what order, more or less, we would be able to meet our needs before proceeding to the next, for Rogers, it was a little different. For him, this was achieved, self-actualization can be achieved through the formation of a healthy self-concept. But the formation of a healthy self-concept doesn't necessarily follow a specific process. It doesn't follow a hierarchy. It doesn't follow certain steps. Rather, it's an ongoing process that is shaped by the person's life experiences. So this process begins even when you are very young. It actually begins to develop during childhood. And it's heavily influenced by parenting because it begins to develop in childhood. So it's important to note that people, you, me, the person sitting beside you, your family members, we all need biological things, but not just that. We also need something psychological. So this is aligned with Maslow's view of our needs, right? We have biological needs, but we also have psychological needs. And when it comes to psychological needs, we have this need to be accepted and respected by others, or to receive positive regard from others. Positive regard is a sign of approval, a sign of acceptance, a sign of being rewarded or recognized for things that you've done, or just for being yourself. So we all have this need to feel that from others. And sometimes we feel like we have to pursue it. And when we feel like we have to pursue this positive regard from others, we can disregard or distort certain experiences of our own inner feelings and desires because we want to get that positive regard so much because of the importance that positive regard has to us. And when we find ourselves having to pursue or to work towards positive regard in such a way that we tend to distort our reality or we tend to deny certain aspects of it, we are dealing with conditions of worth. Conditions of worth are experienced when a child is made to feel like they're only worthy if they have certain thoughts or certain feelings, but not others. So examples of this would be some people might feel like they're only worthy if they're happy. And if they're sad, they might be a burden to others, and therefore they are not worthy of the time of others. That is a condition of worth. For some, it could be achievements. Achievements will merit positive regard, and therefore you need to achieve to feel worthy. That's an example. That's an example of a condition of worth. So sometimes this can be helpful to us, right? It teaches us to work towards certain things. It can motivate us. But what Rogers says is, life with conditions of worth is not the healthiest thing. It will not help us develop a healthy self-concept. But instead, it's unconditional positive regard that will help us develop that. Unconditional positive regard is experienced when there is no need to deny or distort certain experiences because you are accepted, you are regarded for who you are. You don't have to change anything, you don't have to prove anything or to meet anything. That is what unconditional positive regard is. It's kind of like if, for some of you maybe, you know that your parents would like you to have high grades, but you know that they will love you and still respect you even if you don't get an A or a perfect score. That is an example of an unconditional positive regard when it comes to the aspect of academics. It can shape how we are also later on in life and how we view ourselves later on in life. So see here, there's an acknowledgement that our environment growing up plays an important role in our development. So remember, being able to develop a healthy self-concept, an authentic self-concept, is part of the self-actualizing process, which is the highest need, according to Rogers. So as part of that process, we seek to maintain congruence between the self and between experiences. So remember, the self is the organized set of your subjective perceptions, of your experience and events around you, and of experience that actually comes at you. So we want to make that as congruent as possible. So sometimes we have experiences of conditional positive regard or conditions of worth, and these past experiences can teach us in a way to deny or distort experiences that can threaten the self-system. So an example of this might be believing that you are not worthy if you are sad because in the past, you were told by your parents that ipapamigay ka nila kung umiyak ka, or bibigay ka nila sa guard, papahuli ka sa guard kung umiyak ka, and that may have left a mark. So later on, you may learn to distort an experience of sadness to, di, okay lang ako, okay lang, kaya ko to, when in fact it's actually really hard. So that brings about incongruence then. It brings about a distortion or a denial of your experience of sadness, and that makes things incongruent. On the other hand, unconditional positive regard, if you were told whenever you would cry that it's okay, but there's a limit to it, for example, that they'd still love you, you're annoying right now, but they'd still love you, and you knew that, then that takes away the need to deny or distort experiences. You would just know that, okay, I feel sad, and it's okay that I feel sad over this. But the way that I express my sadness could be regulated, for example. So that takes away the need to distort anything because you already have that learning that it's okay to experience what you're experiencing, and you will receive positive regard. You will be accepted regardless of how you experience it. So therefore, what is needed to form a healthy self-concept, what is needed to be able to journey towards self-actualization, is unconditional positive regard. And remember, since self-concept develops in childhood, there are developmental factors that have to be considered at two levels of analysis. The first are parent-child interactions. You need to look at the parent-child dynamic and think, did this family provide this child with unconditional positive regard? Were they able to provide an environment that is optimal for psychological growth? Answering that question in whatever way will help you understand the self better, the person's self better, or maybe yourself even. The second level are internal psychological structures. And this is analyzed by asking questions like, does the person experience congruence between self and daily experience? Or do they tend to distort aspects of experience to attain the regard of others? Or to maintain a consistent self-concept? So there's a part of it that's kind of similar to psychodynamic in the sense that it tells you your childhood is important in shaping your personality. That's the first level. But on the second level, there's a part that's totally up to you already, which are your internal psychological structures. You may have been predispositioned towards believing or perceiving things a certain way, but ultimately, your internal psychological structures, whether you experience congruence or not, also play a major role in the development of your personality. So ultimately, what is this saying? Rogers isn't saying that parents should not impose rules and should not tell their children how to behave a certain way. That's not it. He's saying that what would be optimal is if the child can experience being fully accepted for who they are, but also knowing that their parents can disapprove of certain behaviors that they have, like tantrums, biting other people, throwing things, shouting, things like those. Knowing that their parents can disapprove of these behaviors, but at the core of it, still love them. That is a tricky balance, but to Rogers, that is what can help bolster a healthy development of the self. Again, it helps because it takes away the need to have to behave a certain way or to have to view things a certain way just to feel like you'll be accepted by others. Because if you have that unconditional positive regard experience, then that would takes away the need to distort things. So when we have that growing up, we're more able to journey towards seeking self-consistency and congruence between our senses of self and our everyday experiences, because there's less of a need or a motivation to distort things or to align them with a certain way of being. And there is a higher likelihood that most behaviors will be consistent with the concept of the self already, and they don't have to be distorted or denied or viewed otherwise. The goal is to develop a sense of congruence between the self and the experience, and between what people feel and how they view themselves. So congruence comes from external, what's actually happening, how you view it, how you interpret that and what it means about you, but also how you feel and what that says about you. So that having all of these aligned, having all of them being congruent, will help in that process of self-actualization. On the other hand, though, incongruence is experienced when you feel like you're acting in ways that are not me, when you try to dress a certain way to fit in, when you try to put on makeup a certain way just to try this new trend and it doesn't feel good to you. This is incongruence. And usually when we experience incongruence, we feel a sense of distress. You feel a sense of being uneasy. So that brings us to the next part. This part talks about the healthy individual and how we journey towards meeting that need of self-actualization. So to illustrate further, remember, when it comes to the self as a subset of the phenomenal field, there are two parts of it, the actual self and the ideal self. So the actual self is how you are now, and the ideal self is how you view yourself in the future. Ideally, one with potential traits that you want to possess later on. So congruence is achieved when the ideal self overlaps significantly with the actual self. When you are seeing traits that you would like to have as traits that you already have, that is an achievement of congruence. You're not really striving to be something that you're not. You're already contented with who you are. While incongruence is experienced in this way. The actual self is detached or alienated from the ideal self. You're pining towards characteristics or personality traits or behaviors that aren't really you. and that is what causes incongruence. And that brings us to the next important process under the person-centered theory, which is incongruence and defensive processes. So again, incongruence, as mentioned earlier, is more likely to develop if growing up, the person experienced many conditions of worth. So again, you only get a good job, or you only get a hug if you get a perfect score, or a reward if you get a perfect score, or you only get noticed if you are top-notcher or if you're number one, or you only get treated well if you are smiling and happy, and you're ignored if you're sad. Those are examples of conditions of worth, and they can lead to a higher likelihood of developing a sense of incongruence. And again, incongruence, the disparity between the actual self and the ideal self, comes from a need to deny or distort aspects of the self so that you gain positive regard from others, because that's something that we all need and want. So sometimes anxiety is felt. According to Rogers, anxiety is actually a result of the discrepancy between the experience and the perception of the self. So the actual self and the ideal self. When there is a large disparity or a significant disparity or discrepancy, that is when anxiety is felt, according to Rogers. So whenever this happens, we will be motivated to defend ourselves, because again, anxiety is not a pleasurable emotion. Nobody really wants to feel anxious, so we want to do something about it. And similar to the psychoanalysts, Rogers believes that we will be motivated to defend ourselves if we encounter this feeling of anxiety. But how will we do that? He actually talks about several defensive processes. The first being subception. Subception happens when we don't allow an experience to become conscious because we perceive it as threatening to our self-concept. So think of it as something similar to denial of the psychoanalytic perspective. We tend to deny awareness to this experience because it is relatively incongruent with our self-structure. So an example of this might be iniwan ka na ng boyfriend or girlfriend mo, and you aren't allowing yourself to believe that the relationship is over. Because if the relationship is over, that means you're a failure, for example, and you don't see yourself as a failure. Therefore, you're denying the existence or the actual occurrence. That is a subception. No, the relationship's not yet over. We're still fine. I'm still capable of handling this relationship and whatever else that might bring about for you or that might mean for you. That is an example of subception, the denial of something happening or the denial of an experience that doesn't align with the perception of the self, with the self. The second is distortion. So distortion tends to be more common according to Rogers. This is when we allow the experience into our awareness, but in a form that makes it more consistent with the self. So distortion would be, oo nga, nag-break nga kami, but it was all her fault, his fault. None of it was my fault, for example, because if anything was your fault, that might mean you're a failure. And that, again, doesn't align with your self-concept, for example. And the third is rationalization. This is when a person distorts behavior in such a way to make it consistent with the self. So again, going back to that breakup example, you would like to believe that you don't fail at things. You never fail at things. And it doesn't make sense that you failed at a relationship. So rationalization would be, no, kasi na-affect na yung studies ko, na-affect na yung studies niya. So it was really the best. And, you know, it was the best decision for us at the time. That's an example of rationalization. The fourth is fantasy. So fantasy is when we have a grandiose view of the self, when we distort things to make them seem better about us than they actually are. So this could be in the form of, buti nga, pinutulan ko siya after the breakup, for example. So as you can see, Rogers also highlights how we tend to defend ourselves from feelings of anxiety. But in this way, when we tend to defend from feelings of anxiety, they tend to lead to more incongruence. So it's kind of like a cyclical thing. We experience incongruence, we feel the need to defend because we feel anxious over that incongruence, and in the process of defending, we experience more incongruence because it's more of a distortion, more of a denial of certain realities or experiences that we have. So therefore, what is this saying? The relation of the experience to the self-concept is actually key for our health and our well-being, according to Rogers. So as a therapist, and since Rogers is primarily a therapist as well, I felt it good to highlight this, the client-centered therapy approach, which focuses on psychological change. So For Rogers, the main focus of his profession was really in the process of psychotherapy. Now, take note, it's the process, not the outcome. Unlike behaviorists, their focus was the outcome behavior, and for psychoanalysis, it was the explanation of behavior. But for Rogers, it's the process of psychotherapy. How does psychological change happen? How does the healing happen in therapy? So he committed himself to understanding how that came about. And this process of change or becoming was therefore his greatest concern. So he noticed that what was very important in the process is using this technique wherein they reflect feelings of the client. The therapist reflects feelings of the client so that you can understand what they try to say. And I think that's where non-directive or the client-centered approach came from. Because of this reflection technique, the more active role then of the therapist is in understanding the client's experience, not really on interpreting it in a certain way. Therefore, making it client-centered, yung client yung nasa spotlight. But simply reflecting back feelings is not the main thing that will lead to psychological change. According to Rogers, there are conditions that are necessary for change to occur. And the three conditions are congruence or genuineness, unconditional positive regard, and empathic understanding. So congruence or genuineness, as mentioned earlier, is something that we all strive towards, right? It's the exemplar of being a healthy person, according to Rogers. So the therapist has to exude congruence or genuineness. This is when the therapist is interpersonally open and transparent. They share genuine feelings with their client, even if it's negative. So the therapist doesn't have to put on a mask that they are something that they're not, that they disapprove of something that they actually approve of, but to just be genuine with their client, to not distort their experience or their feelings, and to show that to the client as well. The second is unconditional positive regard. So remember that this is an important aspect of being able to develop a healthy self-concept or a sense of congruence while you're growing up, right? It's not. So what Rogers is telling us is that if we don't really get this from our parents, if we get more conditions of worth from our parents, we're not doomed to just develop incongruence later on. In the process of psychotherapy, you can get this. And if a therapist is able to provide it, that can help with the psychological change. So unconditional positive regard here means that the therapist communicates a deep and genuine caring for the client as a person. So regardless of who you are, what you've done, what you bring to the table, I accept and I care for you as your therapist. I may not agree with certain points of view, I may not agree with certain behaviors, but I accept you for who you are. So this enables the client to explore themselves, their inner self, with confidence and without fear that conditions of worth will come in and they have to distort or deny things or behave a certain way to be able to achieve positive regard. And the last condition that is necessary for change is empathic understanding. This is when the therapist is able to perceive the client's experiences as they are experienced by the client. So it's kind of like being able to understand where the client is coming from, being able to see things from the client's perspective, seeing things from the client's eyes, or viewing their world the way they view it, not really, and avoiding implying your own assumptions. This is usually achieved through the process of active listening, striving to understand the meaning and the subjective feeling of the events experienced by the client. So these three are the necessary conditions for change to occur. So see how aligned they are with the theory that was developed. Because this was the primary practice, this is really where Rogers focused on. So the last part of this lecture, we'll talk about assessment tools. What are the assessment tools that were used aligned with measuring self-concept and the like? The first is the Q-sort technique. The Q-sort technique was developed by Stephenson, and it's composed of sorting cards which have descriptions of personality characteristics. And the person is asked to sort or arrange these cards from most characteristic of me to least characteristic of me. So it kind of combines the lexical hypothesis a little bit, but with a little bit more leeway. Rather than asking you to rate how high or low you have a particular trait and it occurring on a spectrum, here you can say how this is most like you or most unlike you, and you can sort it in that way. So this can be very telling of how an individual views themselves. The second is the semantic differential. This was developed as a measure of attitudes and meanings of concepts rather than as a specific test of personality. So think of it as more of a general method. It is when you evaluate your actual self and your ideal self for polar adjective scales. So there's actually no standardized semantic differential, but it's a general method, as I said earlier. So here you're asked to, let's say, take note of a personality characteristic, like, let's say, creativity. So how creative do you perceive your actual self to be? Rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 or 1 to 7. And then, how about your ideal self? How creative is that? 1 to 5, same rating scale, and so on and so forth. So this, again, is very telling of a person's self-concept and maybe the level of congruence or incongruence that they possess at this time. And that's it. That concludes our brief lecture on Carl Rogers and the person-centered theory. Now let's review. I've prepared several questions for you to try and answer. So here's the first. One of Rogers' main assumptions is that human motives are inherently A, unconscious, B, predetermined, C, positive, D, negative. Pause the video here while you think of your answer. You can write it down or you can just keep it in mind. When you're ready, press play. The correct answer is C, positive. Remember, the perspective is that human beings are fundamentally motivated towards positive growth, aka self-actualization. So our motives are inherently positive in themselves, according to Rogers. The second question is, to develop a healthy self-concept, children need blank from their parents. A, rewards, B, conditions of worth, C, positive regard, or D, unconditional positive regard. Pause the video here while you choose the best answer. The best answer is D, unconditional positive regard. So remember, this is the best because it takes away the need to deny or distort realities just to achieve a sense of regard from others. Now for the last question. Blank is experienced when an individual senses incongruence between their experiences and their self-concept. A, subception, B, anxiety, C, self-actualization, or D, distortion. So again, pause the video here while you select the best answer. The best answer is B, anxiety. This is when the disparity or the discrepancy between the actual self and the ideal self are highlighted, or when incongruence is experienced. And that's it. We're done with our learning check. So to summarize, I found this quote of Carl Rogers that essentially captures his personality theory and what he believes personality is all about. Experience for me is the highest authority. The touchstone of validity is my own experience. No other person's ideas and none of my own ideas are as authoritative as my experience. It is to experience that I must return again and again to discover a closer approximation of truth as it is in the process of becoming in me. This is an excerpt from his book On Becoming a Person, and it captures what his theory is all about. So just to recap, we humans journey towards this goal of forming a healthy self-concept. And to help us achieve that, our parents can give us unconditional positive regard, or that sense that we will be loved and accepted even if we don't meet certain conditions, even if we disappoint them sometimes, or we have certain behaviors that they disapprove of. While conditions of worth are not going to be too helpful because this will give us that sense that we need to distort or deny our experience of reality just so that we will be accepted or regarded by others around us. And depending on our experience growing up, whether we experience more unconditional positive regard or more conditions of worth, we can develop incongruence when there is a discrepancy between the actual self and the ideal self, and there's a significant gap there. And this incongruence can lead to feelings of anxiety, which leads to us feeling the need to defend ourselves or to deny or distort reality further so that we can alleviate that anxiety and make things aligned with our notion of the self. Or when there are more experiences of unconditional positive regard than there are conditions of worth, that sets the stage for having an ideal self that overlaps more with the actual self. Therefore, having a higher probability of achieving a sense of congruence. And all of these help us journey towards the highest need that we have, which is self-actualization. And that's it. Thank you.